Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are on planet Earth. Welcome to what promises to be a timely and important set of virtual and live events this year. This webinar traces a history of anthropology's engagement with artificial intelligence, broadly understood, to understand the contemporary landscape. The next one of these webinars will be Applied AI in Practice, Contemporary Anthropological Contributions to AI Development on January 23rd, 2026 at 12 noon Eastern US time. The third will be Imagining Anthropological Futures with AI on February 20th, 2026, noon Eastern US time. We'll have the sessions at the SfAA. There may be 5 or 10 overall that deal with AI. We are working on a panel with Kate Seek, who's the head of human-centered AI at Toyota, Bryce Mocker, the VP of Decision Science at Domino's Pizza, Noah Siracusa, Xiao Zhang, and Matt Artz, and then a dialogue with Noah, Xiao, and facilitated by Daniel Lindy. And we'll have subsequent webinars leading into summer of 2026. My name is Professor Kiran Jayaram. I am an associate professor of anthropology at the University of South Florida in Tampa. And among other roles, I currently serve as the program chair for the 2026 SfAA annual meeting. My first research project was as a Caribbeanist anthropologist considering labor and educational migrants from Haiti to the Dominican Republic. My subsequent project concerns the cultural dynamics of anthropological training globally, with a current concern on the use of AI. Before I go any further, I'd like to offer my sincere thanks first to Matt Artz for beginning this conversation in the spring of 2025, also to AJ Foss for connecting us, even if it was not through a three-mail. Secondly, to Matt and Laura for agreeing to lead this webinar. Thirdly, to Rosie May, Melissa Cope, Trish Colvin, Lori Buckwalter, and the rest of the SfAA organization for their support for this endeavor. And finally, this project is partly supported by an NSF award 2538588, and we thank Jeff Mance and the rest of the NSF Cultural Anthropology program for their support. Now, just to give a little background into this webinar, uh, I should say that at the SfAAs in 2025, I was on a panel related to AI and pedagogy, and I started off and concluded my presentation with the phrase, "I am a Luddite." And this was not a statement about my embrace of technology, but rather about my ideological position towards industrialization. Um, and that led to my comments. But subsequently, as the program chair, AJ Foss put me in touch with Matt Artz, and we talked about and developed a National Science Foundation proposal, which was approved last year. And this may lead to, in the future, some sort of formal presence as in the Society for Applied Anthropology. Future activities might lead to some publications, some presentations, maybe even revising and extending this project if we have positive response for multiple years. And that's basically kind of give you some sort of framework for what's going on here, what's happened and what will happen, kind of relevant for the topic today. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Matt, and I understand that Laura may be having some issues with connectivity from Germany, but Matt Artz is an anthropologist, designer, and technologist specializing in AI product development. He's the founder of Azimuth Labs, adjunct professor at University of Pennsylvania, creator of the Anthropology in Business and Anthro to UX podcasts, and co-editor of MTech Anthropology and Anthropology in AI. This edited volume, which will be available, even though it's on Matt's shelf, would be available, I believe, in January 2026, late January, through Routledge, and it was with Lora, Koycheva, Angela Vanderbroek, and Matt as co-editors. Apart from the introductory and concluding chapters, the book contains a section on contexts and frameworks, critical perspectives, and socio-technical interactions. Lora Koycheva is an anthropologist and technologist working at the intersection of anthropology, innovation, entrepreneurship, and robotics. She is the assistant professor at the chair of Technoscience Studies in Brandenburg Technical University. She's also building Robots Actually, a global initiative to rebuild the human condition with robots. From 2020 to 2023, she was a convener of the EASA, the European Association for Social Anthropology, Applied Anthropology Network. She holds a PhD in anthropology from Northwestern University. At this point, we'd like to, as much as possible, learn something about you all. So if you wouldn't mind in the chat, if you could give us, if you're comfortable, your name, your institution and or position, and something about your creative production or consumption, which is not necessarily scholarly academic, just something about you. And so if you have questions, as I see there are already people putting questions in the Q&A, that's where you want to put those questions, and we'll reserve the chat for other things. And so I don't know, Matt, do you have anything else to add about your introduction or...
Well, welcome everybody. As Kiran said, this is going to be a series of talks and events at the annual meeting. So we welcome everybody to participate in these. They are free. There will also be sessions after the fact. Um, so, stay tuned, check out SfAA on LinkedIn and obviously all social channels. Follow it. I'll post stuff as well if we're connected. And feel free to reach out if you want the information. But basically, we'd love to have you involved, and we'd love to have you at the annual meeting as well, to sort of participate. And so I will say that Laura, I knew early this morning she was having some sort of internet issues. We're going to assume she is having one at the moment. I will sort of represent us today, but I am, as Kiran said, one of three co-authors on the forthcoming Anthropology AI. And so I will probably, by, I will be representing my view as that's who I am, but, it was a team effort. So anyway, why don't we maybe just jump right into it? So Kieran, you're on mute, but I'll pass it to you to kick it off. Yep, you're on mute.
The chat seems to be disabled. Do you have the power to fix?
You are unmuted now.
Yeah.
You're
Do you have the power to fix the chat?
in what sense?
It's apparently disabled.
I would say to put questions in QA if that's what you mean.
Well, yeah, I was going to do the introductions in the chat. That's what.
I will look.
Okay.
I'll multitask.
All right. Well, in the meantime, yeah, so we have a couple of dates, as someone asked already, for the webinar that's in 2 weeks. On the January 23rd, we have another webinar on February 20th. And if you watch your SfA website emails and these sorts of things, we'll have the other events. And of course, we look forward to seeing you all at the SfAA if your um, time and money and energies allow for such participation. So at this point, do, 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 um, let's talk a little bit about this general history, because I think AP, at least when I heard about AI, I was thinking it was about something that started maybe a couple of years ago with, roots going back to, large, to big data and these sorts of conversations. But when you get into it, the history is much older. So what gets lost when anthropology's earning, well, for one, what's the history of AI and what's the anthropology's role in this?
Sure. So let me first start and say that when I use the term AI, I really do mean it in its broadest, in its broadest sense. I am not speaking of chatbots, nor am I speaking of large language models, though of course it does include those. So generally speaking, when I use the term AI, unless I specify a very particular field or technology, I am speaking of it sort of at large, right? And at large, its exact date of when it goes back to would be debated by scholars for sure. There's the Dartmouth 1956 conference where the term is coined. Arguably, you could say it goes back to the cybernetics movement before that, of which anthropologists were sort of key players in, and we touch on that in the book. And it goes back further than that. We even do a very, very brief summary of, Turing's computing machines, and you could make the argument that that sort of goes back to the loom in some sense, right? And starting to kind of, which, almost is like sort of lends itself to being the first sort of software program, right? So there's a long, complicated history of AI that, if you got 10, 20 scholars in a room, they probably wouldn't agree on exactly when it starts and, all the attributes of it. Most people don't even really completely agree on how you frame up like or what the boundaries are of technologies and fields. And but what I'm going to say here is again, when speaking of AI, I'm generally speaking of it broadly. And for me, there are two very big branches that basically go back to the beginning, and that is symbolic AI and neural nets. Chatbots, large language models, or at least the chatbots of today, which are grounded in large language models, are very much grounded in neural nets, right? But I am going to make the argument here that they are both incredibly valuable. And in fact, a lot of the work that I'm engaged in brings them together. And so let's, like, when talking about AI, move beyond the chatbot and think about all of the great or all of the opportunities. And last thing I'll say before maybe kicking back to Kiran to sort of build on that is that the, you know, some people right now, I know there's a lot of debate over particularly chatbots and LLMs and like, is there value or not? Right. But let's sort of frame this in a much bigger conversation. We already do have driverless cars, of which, legendary anthropologists like Melissa Sefkin has worked on. We have, Google DeepMind has already basically helped, establish the protein folding pattern of 200 million proteins. They've taken material sciences from, I think, roughly around 20,000 known to about 2.8 million. We already have coming out of DeepMind and like another recent startup out of Stanford, solving hundreds of year old mathematical problems. We're writing code for very long periods of time. Like I have code like literally generating right now on another computer in front of me, right, for a project I'm working on. Um, there is like really serious movement here that goes beyond writing, just beyond chatting with a chatbot. And like that's the framing that we should come to this to, I think, for this whole series. There's a long history. Anthropologists have been involved in a long time, and we can get into that in a little bit more in just a second. Um, but it's long, it's complicated, it's messy. There's starts, there's stops, or booms and busts. And importantly, we appear to be in like sort of the next boom as a result of large language models. And I'm going to make the argument right out of the gate that this is an excellent opportunity for all of us to get involved and try and shape that next boom as early as possible so that we don't have like another social media moment. But let me just pause there. I mean, Kieran, anything you want to probe into?
Well, yeah, I mean, you made reference to this long history of anthropologists and AIs. I mean, I was not surprised, but surprised when I heard about the connection of Margaret Mead back in the 40s and 50s. So could you talk just a little bit about some of these, while I about those sort of engagements, while recognizing, as you have in some of your written work, that there's not necessarily a single through line. This is not like a staged evolution, but that history in all of its forms is always a little bit messy. But could you give us some sort of understanding of some of the sort of stops and starts?
Yeah, so the cybernetics movement kind of growing out of a confluence of activities, including a series of meetings that predated that. Well, sorry, there's the cybernetics movement, which predates anthropology. There's these meetings known as the Macy Conferences, run for about 10 years. Mead and Bateson are involved in those as key players. That Angela on our team did some great work to kind of really dig out a little bit of that history and make that present in the book. And Those meetings themselves have even precursors, as everything does. And, that sort of becomes the intellectual sort of stimulus for really kicking this off. And you then get the 1956 conference at Dartmouth, term is coined, and we're sort of off and running with that name. Now, around there, there is a whole host of things going on for those who might follow, like, innovation studies, right? Claude Shannon and information theory, at Bell Labs, right? There's a whole host of things that are sort of happening in that broad period, 40s, 50s, that are all relevant, all coming together. And you essentially get this birth of the discipline where, in many ways, right, they're trying to mimic some kind of human capacity, reasoning, vision, hearing, whatever it may be. Um, Nowadays, text generation, image generation, right? Mimicking kind of human capabilities by a machine. And you get those two fields that I mentioned from the beginning, symbolic, neural nets. Symbolic is very formalist. It's essentially changed through the years. Maybe what's most prominent you could think of in the 80s and 90s, there were expert systems, but there were also earlier systems that were considered symbolic AI. And expert systems were trying to sort of in a very formalist way, like, codify knowledge, often decision trees. Famously, we have a lot of books. Do I even have it here? No, I don't have it with me, but Diana Forsyth, right, her writings, she did a lot of work in medical informatics. Those are the book that was written, and came out in the 90s after she passed, brings a lot of that work together. There's articles as well, right? So like that's a kind of key area of symbolic. And then there is also sort of the neural net, which is that track is largely, as it is said, trying to replicate the way, the human brain sort of works. Um, Early back then, there was not the computing capacity, there was not the data, there was a whole host of sort of infrastructural reasons why, that was very challenging into 2012-ish era, mid 2000s or mid 2010s. Nevertheless, you have those really moving the whole time with, again, starts and stops. The busts are often called AI winters, right? And so there are periods in which these sort of both sort of die down, particularly after the 80s and 90s expert systems really kind of take a dip down. Neural nets were, always there, but slow to move given the constraints that I just said until, again, kind of 2010s. You start to get quote unquote big data because of cloud systems like social media, other efforts to create large image sets and, whole host of efforts there that start coming together to make that model of what we might think of as machine learning, now increasingly, deep learning, really take off and flourish. But along the way, whole host of interesting things, with anthropologists involved. So there's in a lot of articles that I have coming out or are coming maybe, a little bit in the intro or articles that are coming out or chapters that are coming out. I often reference anthropologist by the last name of Kippen, who was working on the Bull processor, which is basically a symbolic AI system to try to make sense of tabla drumming. As a person who likes music, I'm particularly fond of that example. Sally Jo Cunningham in the 90s was using symbolic AI to try and make sense of kinship structures. Linguistic anthropologists were doing the same thing with early symbolic work in the 60s, trying to make, sense of language. Right. And so there's like a really deep engagement that has played out with both of those two big branches of AI over a long period of time. And then starting, as anthropologists particularly coming like in many out of like the business anthropology or design anthropology sort of spirit. We're getting engaged in the 90s and even a little bit sooner than that in tech companies. And as that sort of research practice within those companies really flourished, you get the work of, like I said earlier, Melissa Sefkin and others who were doing interesting work in that space. And the 2000s is a period of where there is a lot of work happening, 2000s, forward. We know there's a lot of work happening, but there's not a ton in the there's So not always a lot in print, probably because many anthropologists were working in tech companies where they can't publish about it. Nevertheless, there was a lot doing really great work. But there was also a swing in the sort of mid 2000s where we kind of very much swung kind of in the critical data, critical algorithm sort of direction, at least what's in print. And a lot less of what is in print is about revealing how do we build systems. And one of the things that some of our chapters are trying to do is sort of bring that back into the conversation and unveil that as best as possible.
Yeah, Matt, I'm glad you talked about that sort of anthropologists becoming involved in AI and business and industry and but then at the same time there's kind of a drop off in the scholarly stuff. And do you think as you can see it, do you think that also is sort of you look at the larger time frame of the 500th anniversary of, Columbus's arrival in the Americas, and that was also the sort of rise of the decolonizing anthropology with Faye Harrison and others, the sort of push towards, a critical, almost borderline activist sort of push. Do you think that had any sort of way of not only that production is not being, publicized, but also that it may not be of interest as much to people, even though business anthropology kind of arose at that time?
I mean, I think you could probably make the argument that that the academy swung in that direction, right, in a pretty hard way. And in fact, again, speaking to like going beyond just chatbots, right now we're working on a special edition for Human Organization, journal published by the Society for Applied Anthropology, in which my article on AI is basically on neurosymbolic AI. And so I went out, I got the bibliometric data of all of the SfAA journals articles and put that into a knowledge graph, and I'm communicating with that via an LLM. And as a result of that, I'm able to actually see how the conversation has shifted over time with, sort of movements like decolonization, or how health has come in and out, or development, has come in and out. All of that becomes fairly present when that's structured in a graph that you connect to. And yes, point is there was a clear sort of swing in one direction. I'm not going to say that that's a space that I'm an expert in, and so I'm not going to go too much further on that. But clearly, right, there were larger cross-cutting, right, currents that probably shaped the direction of publishing. And it's at least my perspective, and part of like what you, if anybody reads the book, what you will see in the conclusion is generally me arguing to say that like we need to get back to building and intervening. Not to say that there's not plenty of anthropologists who do that. There certainly are in a business or in an organizational context, both for profit and nonprofit and governmental. But we need more people, I think, getting back to intervening, right, again, to sort of get in on the ground floor of this latest boom so that we continue to help shape it, while it's still sort of early.
Well, I mean, I think there have been with my discussions with different people, whether they're anthropologists or not, some of them have been really scared or hesitant to be involved because they're like, well, this is this AI intelligence, and they think of this Will Smith movie when the robots start to take over the world, and that if this is AI intelligence, well, associating those terms with sentient and intelligent, from an anthropological perspective, why is that question analytically unproductive? And what would be better to focus on instead?
So not everybody would agree that it's unproductive, and that's more of a take of certainly of mine, and to a degree, Laura. I don't want to put words in anybody else's mouth, but Laura and I chat a lot, and so I know that she shares that view. And it's not that somebody shouldn't take that up, right? There are interesting philosophical questions there. It's uninteresting to me to get bogged down in debates of is it intelligent? Are we going to reach AGI and when? Those are somewhat uninteresting to me because even in the current state, with the newest wave of quote unquote AI, but also technologies that go back to the 40s, like the example I just gave, which, involving sort of symbolic, um, there is such a deep pool of work to be done there, right? There is so much space to play in, and there is already so much utility, right? I, on a frequent basis, right, will want to collect data and kick off an agent to go run and collect that data for me as I'm doing something else, right? And I am building products that I couldn't build myself, only 6 months ago. I'm now able to build and deploy, right, and use for my own purposes, which was not doable. So there is already so much utility if you're willing to go beyond a chatbot and dig in, kind of learn the stuff and figure out how to turn this into something to benefit ourselves, the world, our discipline, right? And so whether or not it's intelligent is basically for me, somebody else can pick that up and run with it. I'm worried about putting my head down, learning this, staying relevant, solving problems, and having a great time doing it, to be frank. I mean, I'm creating things that I've wanted to create for years. Years ago, AAA and I proposed a grant to try and do what I just did, with the bibliometric data. And, we were shut down for a reason. But, I couldn't build those tools years ago. It would have taken me an enormous amount of manual time probably to put all that together. These days it's easy, right? So I'm focused on utility, intervening, what we can do to make a difference, to both shape the technology, to solve problems of the world, rather than get bogged down on questions of is it intelligent or not. And we have Laura. Laura, welcome.
Hi, and I'm so very sorry. In a classic case of this anthropology, then there's technology, and then there's the infrastructure and the environment within all of which this happens. There were issues with connectivity due to really bad weather. So my apologies to everyone.
Well, well, Laura, thank you so much for being here. In light of all the issues that you're dealing with locally, thank you for being here. Um, we've already introduced you, but do you have any sort of anything you want to say? We've touched upon your affiliation and your robots actually, and you're a convener of the YASA Applied Anthropology Network. You got your PhD from Northwestern. Any other sort of details or plugs you want to make right now before we get back to this conversation? I have a question I can use to piggyback off what Matt said, but
No, I'm happy just to join the conversation and thank you for introducing me.
okay, great. Well, as Matt was just talking about, whether or not intelligence is the wrong focal point, um, what concepts should anthropology be foregrounding when thinking about AI from your perspective, Laura?
Yeah, I mean, I think Matt and I probably, it's fair to say, share a bit of, well, for myself, I can say a bit of an impatience with the question of intelligence, because I think it only affords us a very constrained at the current moment analytical and conceptual mileage. I think AI a massive unstable object as it is, right? I mean, there's so many things that go into this concept of AI, but even if we stabilize this concept for a second, I think it's so important to see that it affords anthropology an opportunity to really bring a lot of its insights that it has collected and championed for years around relations, especially with things living and non-living, with with different assemblages and materialities, and championing the idea that different conceptual and epistemological worlds exist. And so I think, just to use the vocabulary and the preoccupations that are happening currently in the public debate around is it intelligent or is it not intelligent really forecloses the opportunity for us first of all, intellectually bring to the topic so much of that knowledge that we have been championing and producing for years, right? And that would enrich incredibly the conversation and also the way that these systems are built. And Yeah, I mean, infrastructure is one that I immediately can think of as a concept that both anthropology and STS share, especially as AI is entering a very infrastructural moment, and it's becoming kind of more the environment rather than just a tool that we're using. It's kind of saturating the the world that we are inhabiting. Um, so that would be, one concept that I can think of. Another one, obviously, is agency, not only when we're talking about agents, but also when we're thinking about what kind of agencies does AI afford to anthropology at the current moment. I'm a very firm belief that AI is an immense opportunity for anthropology to scale and to go viral in the world in ways that we didn't have before, simply because AI operates on different scales itself than anthropology does. And that point is as conceptual as it is methodological, as it is applied. So materiality is another, we could go on and on, but I think those two just as a start of that conversation, to put it out there on people's mental maps that perhaps we really ought to be moving away from that conversation now about is it intelligent? How intelligent is it? Is it more or less intelligent than we are? What else comes after this is my question.
Well, from that, I'd like to kind of integrate what you all were talking about with some of the questions and concerns raised in the Q&A. There have been people who've mentioned, there's someone who mentioned that, like, is this the end of field work for anthropology? There was the mention, kind of like what I had hinted at with my initial remarks about the Luddites and the concern for, the effects of AI on the workers. There was the mention of the environmental impact of some of these data centers and whatnot. So, what would be a way to, well, what would be ways of getting involved as an anthropologist to shape AI, for example? And how is it that one could balance a critical role with the need to be involved with AI? You know, can you build something with the master's tools, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I have thoughts there. So, as I've said, as I kind of hint at in the conclusion, and and I hinted at it because there's a chapter coming out in, I don't know, about 2 weeks in a book titled, I think, Digital Anthropology by Devin Proctor, where I have a chapter on AI. And basically, I'm sort of framing out the concept of AI anthropology as studying it critically, using it methodologically, and then importantly intervening, right? And so I think we need to do as anthropologists as many of us as possible. I not know not everybody's necessarily going to build products, which is actually how I technically framed it in that chapter. But like where my thinking has gone is I think we all have an opportunity to study it, and we should, and be critical about that. We all have an opportunity to use this, and it will impact field work, and it already is. And I'll elaborate on that. And we have the ability to intervene, right? If you don't want to go build a tech product, you can get out, you could go get a policy job, right? There would be many different types of roles that everybody can get involved in, including, of course, teaching, right? But there would be lots of ways in organizations outside of academia to get involved, even if you're not going to be like, I'm in a product management role, like, some people are in sort of UX research roles, or maybe other research roles in labs, right? So all of that is in play for anybody that really wants to do it. And we have a long history of studying it, and we have a lot of work to build on there, but there's probably new scholarship, opportunities as a result of everything. In fact, I have a paper that should be out in a few weeks in which I'm putting out forward the idea of multi-agent ethnography. So to build on what Laura said about agency. So not to debate are these systems have agency or not, taking more of like the STS view of they do, right? What would it mean to have basically a team of machines who are out there doing work on your behalf, right? Which I have locally running, right? I have tools that I put out on GitHub, which I could even link to on this, which uh, will build code books, segment, interview transcripts, code that work via deductive and inductive coding involving pruning and merging and all that, build those up into themes, tie that back to the actual text. And those are individual notebooks that you can run, but I have them running locally on a computer and I know I'm being a little technical here, but as an MCP server, so I can just chat with it via an LLM and just kick it off. And I can cycle through a whole bunch of different lenses, like theoretical lenses to understand that data. Right. And that's just analysis alone. But like, there's agents already, that I'm working on for planning and communication. Right? You can spin up beautiful dashboards of data with almost no effort anymore. Right. All you have to think about is what are you trying to achieve in the end? And this stuff can get built for you with ease. Right. And so this is a ripe opportunity for all of us to get involved. And I would make the argument, well, we're not going to go out of business, right, as a field, as a discipline. It is significantly going to impact our field, and arguably it probably already is. We do know that there are many, UX researchers, which is like one of the key roles anthropologists went after over the past 15 years. Right? We know there's a lot of folks in those roles who have been let go, and it's not just AI, it's a whole confluence of issues. But we know there's disruption there. We know there's disruption in market research, right? So the question is if it is disrupting us already, what do we do about that? I think embracing it, not running away from it is key, right? And that means getting involved and figuring out how to do this work as soon as possible so that you can sort of bring that into your own work to enable yourself to stay competitive because, organizations have moved over a very long period of time in a computational direction, probably will continue to, because it's perceived as, it's quant, right? It's big, it's scalable. We need to be able to find a way to be like computational social scientists in my worldview to stay sort of on par with data scientists, but in fact, maybe bring something extra, bring like light data science skills plus the sort of interpretive lens. Could elaborate on any of that, but Laura, why don't you jump in?
Uh, well, I think um, I'm gonna kind of latch on this question about fieldwork and is AI going to make fieldwork in specific obsolete? And I'm actually, as much as I'm optimistic about AI, I'm also very optimistic about anthropology and fieldwork in specific, because I think that as a set of experiential methods and a kind of embodied, immersive way of knowing, this actually continues to give us a bit of an edge. However, I should qualify that everything that Matt said until now about being competitive and about how do we, respond to the fact that computational techniques and computational disciplines have a lot more currency at the moment and will most likely continue to have currency a lot more than I would say anthropology has at present. I think, and again, I also discussed this a bit in the conclusion of the book. To me, AI challenges the form that anthropology takes, and so the question is, what kind of form of both inquiry as a knowledge production field, but also as a form of engaging with the world and as a form of professionalization anthropologists are going to have. And I would not say, scrap fieldwork. I think I would never say that because I find, and there is work in progress that will be coming out from me to that account. But I would definitely say that we need to find institutional ways in which to catch up with the computational techniques that Matt is talking about, and that the AI moment requires. So that will be something that I think is something that's really urgent that programs address in preparing graduates. And that at this intersection of these quite disparate logics, right, of fieldwork, of old-fashioned shipping out to somewhere, landing with somehow knowing the language, potentially deploying an AI so that you can complement your language skills. Who knows, right? So the form of doing fieldwork is changing. The form of anthropology is changing. That's something that we should be embracing. And we should be having a lot more conversations than what we're currently having. I don't know if you already touched upon the topic of how skeptical the humanities and social sciences are of techno-solutionism and techno-optimism, but that I think that's not the strategic way of going forward. And that skepticism really needs to be put to a different kind of use within the field.
Yeah, I think as there's kind of been sprinkled throughout this is a skepticism and criticism, and I think that's healthy just for any sort of intellectual endeavors that you don't just want to say, okay, it's all good, or and yet at the same time you don't want to say it's all bad. I mean, I
Right,
think I recall that in conversations I've had where people have said, oh, when word processing came out and they had spell check, people said this is going to be the doom of the English language because now no
right.
one's going to know how to spell. Um, and so I'm wondering if you two might think about maybe just some articulating some practical uses of AI, as well as touching on the maybe skills that are required, because not everyone needs to be a computer engineer to engage with anthropology and AI, right? So could you kind of address those sort of potential skills that might be needed at different levels that you talked about?
Sure. I can jump in. So, again, AI broad field, there are some entry points, right, are much easier to get into. As much as I've been saying this whole time, think beyond chatbots. A chatbot is a wonderful entry point. In fact, I would make the argument the reason that AI, quote unquote, exploded right now is because it sort of jumped the invisible barrier, right, into an interface design pattern that everybody could use. I didn't say it at the outset, but you could make an argument that a very large portion of the population of the planet uses AI on a daily basis. If they go on social media, if they search anything on a search engine, if they use a mobile phone where they make a call and it's getting routed via AI. I'm not saying every carrier does that, but some do, right? And the list goes on, right? If you use GPS, um, or at least the sort of a map app that makes use of GPS, but more the mapping app, right? If you do like any of those things on a daily basis, and probably most of you have at least weekly for a long period of time, you've been using AI. And so, like, first off, I should have said in the beginning, but like, I make the argument, right, that AI it has already been transformational to the world. And that's to me not really disputable. Whether LLMs will be durable and will transform the world is a different story and up for debate. Nevertheless, with that said, you all have been using it and actually you have experience, right? Your phone uses AI to make better photos, right? It just the list goes on and on. But for the sort of world that we're living in now, a chatbot is a wonderful entry point. The the thing that though you should do is use the chatbot to learn, right? If you have a problem that you want to solve, you can ask the chatbot to teach you about it. And you can ask, like, if you want to write code to actually solve a problem, you don't need to be a software engineer to learn. You just need to know what you want to ask. We call it spec-driven development, right? You are specifying in natural language what you're trying to achieve, and these tools will now help you build it. 2 months ago, the best you got was code. Now you're getting full applications that you can deploy, right? And so I think the best thing to do is get in and play, and specifically think about using it to play with Python. Think about prompt, engineering and the importance of words and how that then dictates the what you get out of it. If you use Claude, set up projects with really good prompts. If you use ChatGPT, set up custom GPTs with really good prompts. And if you don't know how to write a prompt, ask the machine to write the prompt for you. Just tell it what you want to achieve, and already you will get better results. they write prompts probably better than almost all humans, maybe arguably, right? And so, start there and use it as the tool to learn more about AI and think about how you can generate, again, if you have data and you need to present it, tell it to create a dashboard out of your data or an interactive visualization. They can do those things at this point in time. I'll pause there for Laura.
I will absolutely second the whole idea of playing with the systems. I think play is very much part of the both culture and a kind of operative approach that we're promoting at robots. Actually, for example, where we're really keen on creating experiments with AI, not so much AI, especially robotics, right? With the hardware, physical machines, with which AI is going to increasingly um, enter the physical world. Um, I do think, well, in terms of skills, there's so many free resources online. I'm kind of having a hard time now to make a specific recommendation, but I think it's just to step back from everything that Matt said. I also think thinking about my training that I had in grad school. I think it's very important as a very first step, really way before everything that Matt just said, to have some sort of statistical literacy and to have some sort of a literacy in terms of quantification methods and quant thinking, which to a lot of anthropologists, and I'm not gonna speculate about who's in the audience and whether there's some sort of generational shifts in terms of pedagogy and how currently anthropology is taught. But when I was in grad school in the late like 2007 to 2012, statistics and statistical thinking was just simply not something that was on the radar, especially for cultural and social anthropologists, right? So bioanthros and archies would get a lot more of that in their curriculum. And I think that especially for social and cultural anthros, this is something that needs to start getting embedded, because that's a critical first step to then understanding all of these, the thinking of the machine, right, that leads to all of these other. I mean, Matt is talking about Python, and again, I'm not going to assume too much, but I think for a large chunk of social and cultural anthropologists, this is completely, unfamiliar terrain to use these programs. So I think I would say this is important to create that competency that leads to, and it's important to also do it fast.
Well, I think some of the questions, some of your comments you've all been making is dealing with the training and doctoral training in anthropology and whatnot. Um, and this is something I'm actively pursuing as a line of study, is within my larger project of studying the cultural dynamics of anthropological training, to see these differences on how are faculty using AI, how are students using AI. From my small corner of the world that I've seen, uh, there's been, well, it's just a lack of knowledge, I'll put it that way, about um, both by students about what it can do and from faculty about what it can do, what students can do, and how faculty can use it. So I think when we think about this SfAA initiative, um, that kind of talks about this as a workforce and pipeline issue. Um, how does that kind of, what does that do to notions of pedagogy in graduate programs? And what can faculty ostensibly do so that they're not training anthropologists for the 20th century, basically?
Laura, you want to start?
I think I'm not in the US context, I'm in the European context, and we have an entirely different set of constraints and conversations here in terms of pipeline and pedagogy and the status of anthropology within the larger European academia. I don't want to assume too much about the state of the conversation and institutional constraints over in the US, although I am aware that obviously and funding is more and more scarce, and it's very difficult already to have the organizational and institutional support for what we would consider a must in terms of classic anthropological methods. So I would say it's important. I think what faculty can do, it's important to destigmatize any interest in these topics. It's important to find ways to encourage students to pursue alternatively, I think faculty can get creative even without funding. So they can be bootstrapped, programs and initiatives like camps, like this initiative that you're doing. So I think it's important to first have the right attitude, and second to really start thinking outside of the organizational box that these that these skills can only be taught within the traditional setup of departments that we have had now, because I think obviously there's the concern about departments, the departmental existence of anthropology anyway. So, the question is, how do we teach, these computational techniques and programs and, AI in the current moment, and perhaps why not even co-opt that as a way of thinking of what happens afterwards in case departments close? I think that's a very, it's working backwards from a worst case scenario for anthropology. I think, as I said before, what's the opportunity that AI affords to solve our current problems is a conversation that we should be having also at the institutional level.
And I would just build on that. And, I would actually say that you're going a little step further. We have lots of programs closing around the world, right? We are either losing funding and having significant cutbacks like mergers of social and human sciences, or programs closing altogether. And it's not that being computational solves that problem, at least by itself, though I do personally think it's a component of what the equation needs to look like. Because when you look at how organizations are hiring, right, they are hiring for data scientists, for any number of quote unquote AI roles. And so I do think if programs want to be more competitive, they need to make a number of changes, one of those being more computational. And that will help students, if students have those skills, they are more likely to get jobs, in my opinion, based on the kind of hiring I see. And I've actually gone and collected data on what kind of roles are looking for what skills, and and working on a paper on it. But yeah, I do think that is a component of it. And I think there is a model. So I'm particularly fond of a few programs out of Denmark. I think Aalborg University led the way with the Technoanthropology program. Um, and that's some of the papers that I linked, the work that they did over the past 10, 15 years um, is really inspiring to look at because it is not about accelerationism and don't take, I also hope that nobody misinterprets me today when I'm talking about like using any of this tooling. I'm not talking actually about using the tooling just to go fast per se. I'm actually talking about the tooling in many ways because I actually think, and to the sort of building on the framing and language of a lot of the Technoanthropology Lab folks, right? It's an opportunity to create some friction or dissonance, right? It's a way to grab new data, have a conversation with that data in relation to maybe like the smaller end kind of qual we're used to getting that's deep, bringing all of that again into conversation and thinking about how does it relate or not relate so that we force ourselves to actually go deeper and think about the phenomenon that we're trying to make sense of. And so, they do a lot of computational work, broadly computational social sciences in Denmark and some surrounding neighbors that I think is really inspiring. And not because it just is about efficiency, but it's because it's about using it to sort of think critically about the work that we do. And so I think US programs could look at that program in particular. They could look at the SODAS program out of the University of Copenhagen. They could look at now DTU in Denmark, Danish Technical University, which a few of the folks from the Technoanthropology Lab just moved over to, right? And so there is a lot of models out there of how do we train students in this sort of more emerging space. And importantly, there's even models here that we can pull from it. So I went to the University of North Texas. Every one of my, not like my intro classes, if you will, but every one of my specialization classes, design anthropology, business anthropology, all of them had projects with customers where we were doing the work, right, individually, but also as a group, which is what it looks like when we work in business. And, coming out with a portfolio of work that shows we did this. I worked with Baylor Health System, very large health system. I worked with Pitney Bowes, right? Good names. Those kinds of activities, especially when they're computational projects like the Technoanthropology Lab does for, I'm going to draw a blank on all their case studies, but like, let's say like the Royal Symphony and, other like kind of key institutions in the country, right? That's like real work to train students, really how hands-on how to do the work, to build them a portfolio and to give them the skills that they need to survive and maybe thrive, right, in our current economy. And so I don't think we need to imagine something wholly new. I think we just need to look at what's working and where and pull from it, right? And borrow liberally and reframe the way we think about education in the States.
Yeah, and I think that there, I can't speak. I'd be interested if Laura could talk a little bit about what it's like to be as a faculty member in Europe. Uh, in the US, from my time, there's no institutional funding or support to, you know, if I wanted to learn about how do I how do I craft prompts better? How do I, play with AI? Like this is something which is inherently, extra, right? There's no
Right.
institutional support, and so that's why I think the mention of playing with things is until someone can get an opportunity somehow carved out with them, I think it is important for faculty to kind of um, maybe take a breath and maybe not be so panicked and just say, well, how can this be helpful in teaching? How can it be helpful in research and do things that are maybe more practical that can provide skills and opportunities for students, um, while at the same time, as has been brought up several times in the Q&A, of not foregoing the notion that I think Matt brought up earlier in the talk, that there are really three ways of thinking about the intersection of AI and anthropology. And we've been talking a lot about AI as a tool to use and AI engaging with the way it's built and engaging with industry to look at the shortcomings and the way they're conceptualizing, the engineers are conceptualizing, but also as from a critical perspective as an object to study, whether it's the data centers and the environmental impacts and the use of water. I remember last year I was quoting some statistic about the amount of the number of gallons of water it takes to run a particular search on a data center or something, to cool the centers. So there are these three different ways, but I think allowing faculty to play with it is something they can do in the absence of any sort of institutional support. But Laura, from your understanding, is there such incentive or opportunities in Europe? And I ask because not only just about the US and Europe, because we have people from all over the world on this. So
Right.
to give a broader
Yeah.
perspective.
I mean, when I brought my perspective, or when I made the comment that my experience is in the European context, is mostly um, not about the direct institutional constraints around AI. It's mostly around in Europe, we're currently not under ideological political pressure to defend what anthropology is. We have a different set of problems that very often anthropology is not very visible and gets confused for a number of other disciplines. So that's a different set of questions. I think the programs that Matt mentioned are really very path-breaking programs, and they're really good models. But when you mention playing, I think, and when I was talking earlier about, the way AI challenges anthropology and the form of anthropology, and I'm sure you've probably already, before I joined you, touched upon the whole binary between critique and intervention, and how do we intervene. So what's currently on my desk and the things that I'm writing and reading on is actually, there's critique, there's intervention, and then there's building. And I think in anthropology, we regularly don't think of building as a form of claiming power, because we are very uncomfortable with the idea of having power, of owning these systems. And I think that's something that is important to get into the idea of also to enter into the pedagogies that we have, right? That we can teach students to build with these systems. And I think if you look at teenagers, very often, currently, I'm involved a little bit with the topic of entrepreneurship in late teenage years, right? So there's a lot of interest in entrepreneurship as a kind of vehicle for solving all sorts of problems. And how do we get more people engaged? And if you look at the way that teenagers are approaching AI, it's actually, I would say they're becoming almost AI native in the way that they're using the tools to, build and code platforms and programs. And I think that is something that's extremely exciting, and that we can look at how it can be incorporated into pedagogies that are kind of expanding the anthropological repertoire. In terms of how I incorporate AI in my class, I should say I'm not in an anthropology department, I'm in an SDS department. But essentially, I say this is a method. And the way that I've restructured this year, specifically my class, because I don't want to, I know that students are very much tempted to use AIs in ways that outsources critical thinking, but the ways that I've told them, to approach it is it's just a method. And so if you use AI as a method to anything, be explicit about it and think alongside it and reflect on how you're using it, what are the effects of it. Right. So tinker with it and see what the outcome is. So be creative about it. And the other way that I've structured the class is that it's actually, there's a lot more focus on teamwork, which when we are also talking about changing pedagogies and changing curriculum, that's also not been a very big focus um, in anthropological programs, but I think it's important to it's very interesting to see they don't struggle with AI. They don't struggle with AI with as a method, but they do struggle with teamwork. And so again, I don't know how representative that is of of all programs and all, obviously there's going to be a variety of experiences in cultural and institutional contexts around the world. But I do think that there's an opportunity to incorporate play as a space that's, curious and it doesn't, that doesn't approach the technology with a preconceived notion. It's just, tinkering is good. It's good to tinker with method and it's good to think of AI as a method. And I think that's a good start.
So, yeah, I'm trying to think about this from multiple angles. And, you know, I've been doing my homework, obviously, for the past 6 to 9 months on this. But let's say I'm an absolute novice and all I know about AI is that it's just something that people talk about, almost like a ghost or a phantom. If people were going to play, what sort of tools could just anyone right now go on the internet or download or something to play with? What would be some concrete things? Like, I mean, I have, for example, like ChatGPT, but I think you have to enroll for that. You know, you obviously just search engines are including that, but it's something if you're going to be playing with something, where are some places that people can play?
So I'll quickly touch on that. I'm actually, Karen, going to go back to something you said earlier. So for anybody who's out there who thinks that they need to spend money, you don't. In fact, I spend almost no money on learning other than a YouTube subscription. Um, and I just, as I walk, I just watch videos, right? As I do the dishes, I listen to videos. And, I just turn my downtime into learning time. And so there is, and you could watch those, of course. You don't need a subscription. You could just watch them with ads. But point is whether it's YouTube or whether it's going to Coursera and not enrolling and paying to get the cert, but just taking it for free, or going to what's Andrew um, deeplearning.ai, right? And doing that work for free. Stanford open sourced a big portion of their AI curriculum. Of course, you don't get the degree or anything, right? But you can take the classes there. So like the point is there's actually zero barrier. I don't want to say zero because there's, not everybody has certain information technology in different places of the world and internet speeds are different, right? But um, the barrier to getting free or near free content, right, is nearly gone and has been gone for 10, 15 years. It's out there if you want to go get it, and a quick Google search will return plenty of information. Now, the ones I mentioned are probably a good place to start. Coursera, LinkedIn Learning, deeplearning.ai, Anthropic, maker of Claude, has their own free training. ChatGPT, OpenAI, maker of ChatGPT, has their own free training, right? All of those are worth looking at. The other thing I would suggest is, you know, again, a chatbot, we need to go beyond chatbots and we need to think bigger to turn things into really, right, really capable stuff. At some point, I'm going to write a paper showing off a whole series of tools that I have that are actual applications. But it's a deep pond. And so I would look at things like, I would actually look at the cloud companies because, and particularly I would look at Google but everybody can pick whether it's whether it's Google, Microsoft, or AWS. But I would look at Google services like Google Vertex, right, where you have pretty much the whole capability, and that's not the place to enter necessarily. That's a little level 2 or level 3 or something, right? But the infrastructure is even maybe more important because it's one thing to do something in a chatbot. It's another thing to be able to build something, deploy it somewhere, and have actual tools for yourself to run. In between there, as I said earlier, everybody, not everybody, but many people might want to look at Google Colab, which is a hosted environment for Python. Ask ChatGPT to write you code to run in Google Colab to analyze some kind of data and upload like a sample of that data, right? Play in that way. Go out, get familiar with how do I get an API key to use a large language model, not a chatbot, but like to use a large language model in something more custom like Google Colab or in, one of the Google services. And play in that space, and you will be shocked at the things that you can already build, right? You can, like I said it earlier, but I just backfilled about 100,000 the metadata of about 100,000 articles for all of AAA and Society for Applied Anthropology. And I built myself just a whole bunch of tools over the holidays to do that work. Right. And it's January 9th. And I did that all from natural language, right? I wasn't writing a line of code. And so, those are, some leading resources you could look at. But the key thing is to just dig in and do it, get the hands on the keyboard. When something fails, just ask, one of these models to explain it to you. And, like I mentioned with Google Colab, you can go in there and at the bottom will be, and actually, if you're in it, higher ed, it's free for a year. You can go in there and at the very bottom of the screen, there's going to be a little Google Gemini button. You can click that and just say, build me X, and it will write the whole code for you. And you can just start exploring, like, what does it look like to do topic modeling? What does it look like to create a network graph of data, of bigrams of text? All of these things are wide open. And looking at like the social, the computational social science literature, especially the machinic anthropology article that I linked above, right, would be a good place to go find all the kind of key terms. What does it mean to do topic modeling? What does it mean to do um, named entity recognition? Like kind of all the key methods. Go to that machinic anthropology article, follow back the citations in there, and it will just unpack that whole world for you. Then go to something like Google Colab and just ask it to build you a notebook to do X. Right? You could even upload one of those academic papers and say, I want to try something like this, reverse engineer it and build it for me. And it will literally do it for you. And it will probably get it right on the first try, or else you'll just hit the button again and tell it to clean up the errors, and it will get them cleaned up very quick. And that's how I have learned a lot of what I've learned in this space is just by playing and failing and keeping going. And so I really encourage everybody to just get in as soon as possible. And I do want to answer one question because actually we have Melissa Zefkin on the line. She asked a question about what not to do with a chatbot. And what not to do with a chatbot is to treat it as a database of facts. It is a probabilistic system based on stats. It is only as good as its training data. And if you ask questions and expect that it is going to be a database of all facts in the world and it's going to get all of them right, you're wrong. But you can do a lot of things with an LLM and a chatbot. If you just start looking at what is an MCP server, what are like in Claude, what are skills, and start looking at how you can use those to connect to other systems, you can do some really astonishing stuff. Like I told you, I took the SfAA bibliographic data, put it in knowledge graph in Neo4j, a graph database. And now using Claude Desktop, I'm able to ask questions about that. And I can ask a question like, how has, again, development anthropology changed through time? And it can look at all the titles and abstracts where the abstracts are present and literally with accuracy get that right. It's phenomenal. Right. And that's again neurosymbolic. It's bringing those two old fields of AI together. So like just start playing around in that way. It's a really deep space with a lot of opportunity for us.
The idea of play, I would say, is that you don't necessarily need a map, right? You just start anywhere and then you kind of follow as it goes. And so I think Matt gave a very comprehensive answer. My immediate, when you ask your question, Kiran, the first thing that I thought was Stanford. But obviously, Matt gave a number of other resources. But what I do want to say, and it was interesting that the way that Matt answered was actually more like an engineer than an anthropologist, having worked with engineers and seen how how they prototype systems, admittedly not AI systems, admittedly, humanoid robots. They just learn on the go. They don't say, okay, I'm gonna now take 3 years to get all the knowledge that I need, and then I'm gonna, start doing something with it. It's just learning on the go. Okay, you realize you have a gap in your knowledge. So, what's the fastest minimum viable knowledge that you can get, and from where, so that you can experiment with it. You can immediately iterate with it, and you can see, is that actually knowledge that you really need, or you need something else. So it's also, I think, a question of adopting a bit of the engineering spirit of learning on the go, and not necessarily needing to be, prepared so that you can start approaching and building and playing, and all of these things that we're talking about.
I want to throw a question out to you too, and maybe it's more of the engineering side of this play, or I'm not sure, but so I've kind of gleaned a feeling from some of the Q&A that some people have concerns, and I've heard elsewhere about the ethical aspects of doing this sort of play and the issues of privacy. And can either of you speak to, like, let's say, for example, I have, several big data sets from my own research, from my dissertation and other projects. And if someone were in my situation and let's say they wanted to take this and try and do something with it, what about how is privacy managed and how can someone do that if they're trying to play?
Yeah. There's So first, if you're using a free account, and again, I'm at this time, as much as I say AI is much broader, right? I'm going to just go to chatbots because that's, I know, the entry point for a lot of people in this present moment. If you're using a free account, you need to stop that, right? Assuming you're putting in like data, like don't do that. If you're using a free account and you're putting in any kind of participant data, I would stop that immediately because that could be trained on. If you're using a paid account, you need to also go into your settings and make sure you've turned off the setting in which you've granted them access to train on your data. And I believe at this point you need to turn that off in both ChatGPT and Anthropic. I believe it's now an opt-out in both. I can't speak for all of the chatbots, but check your settings. Um, if you, that said, when you use the APIs, rather than the chatbot interface, right? So behind a chatbot is a large language model. I mean, there could be other types of models, diffusion models for images and other things, but most of it is a large language model. Um, that model, you can use in a number of ways. You could just use it through a chatbot, or you could use it in the sort of more engineering-ish way that you get an API key. When you do that, they are definitely not training on that data. Um, at least, that is the agreement, of course. But beyond that, if you were really cautious, let's say, you had extreme concerns for some reason or another, there are plenty of ways to run models on your own computer. And so the easiest way is probably to use Olama, um, and I will link to that. The problem is the models can take up quite a bit of space themselves, and you need quite a bit of computational power if you want to use a large model. So generally speaking, they're underperforming compared to the large language models that you would get through hosted chatbots. But they also may be good enough for a lot of tasks. There is a tendency of some people to go always like for the biggest model and like always the reasoning version of it, which you don't always need. In fact, when I do a lot of my prototyping, I work with the fastest, cheapest models so that I'm not causing as much environmental harm or, any of those concerns. So I basically prototype with very cheap models and then I scale up to something that's more kind of production oriented when I want to start really using something. Um, but if you use it via the API, it's not training on, and you could always run models locally.
The only thing that I can add to that is actually to look to, I mean, I think it's a highly specific, case-specific question, right? About the nature of the data set and the topic and to what extent actually the information within the data set is recognizable or sensitive or linked back to real people in the real world, right? So to me, it's a little bit hard to answer that question, but yeah, I would say the first thing that came to my mind, Matt already mentioned, because he's actually doing this a lot more than I do, um, is to just use it, run it locally. But as he said, it's a question of having also the right hardware.
Okay. We're at an hour 20 right now, so unless you two had any points you wanted to make in this initial webinar, I'll pause for that. If not, then we can turn to the Q&A and try and get some audience questions. Anything before I do that?
Well, I just want to quickly touch on, so we're going to touch on these in the Q&A, right? But environment, privacy, right? These are real concerns that I also hope that it's just clear that when I'm talking about us getting involved, I'm not downplaying them. There is real opportunity and there is real harm, and both of those will likely come true, right? In very jagged ways across the economy, with different groups being impacted positively and negatively. And neither of us, I know, would be downplaying that. We obviously advocate, and I hope it's okay, I'm speaking for both of us, but we obviously advocate to get involved and learn, not because we think it's all good, but because we think, right, there is something to be gained here. There is an opportunity for the field, for folks who want to sort of work in this space, future jobs, right? And so, and importantly, going back to one of the primary things for me for at the outset, to try and get involved as early on to shape the technology, right? To be hopefully part of a transdisciplinary team that is thinking about how do we build any of this tech, whether it's a model at a frontier lab, whether it's a company, a SaaS company that's taking that model, embedding in a product for law or whatever. And next week we have two folks who will be talking about, not next week, on January 23rd, we have two folks who will be talking about how they embed it in law products, as well as some other really great work. And you're right. So the point here is though is to get involved early on so that we can try to think about like how might we reduce energy consumption? How might we better protect privacy? How might we do machine explainability? And those things are not just going to be figured out by one discipline, whether it's engineering or whatever it may be. They really need diverse teams to think about these hard problems. And I know we're going to get asked some of the questions about those hard problems in a second, but I just wanted everybody to hear that that is our worldview, right? It's not all rosy, but we really think we need to be there for all those reasons.
Absolutely. And two of the main experiments that I'm currently trying to set up within robots actually is precisely around the questions of how an infrastructural turn to AI can lead to a more environmentally responsible AI in terms of water consumption, in terms of how do we cool data centers. So I can't say much more, but hopefully you can go on LinkedIn and follow robots actually, and you can get updates on that. And there will be, as the year rolls and as we're setting these up, there will be updates on those experiments. I don't know. The reason that they're set up as experiments is precisely because a priori, I don't know if it's possible to make AI more environmentally responsible and to reduce its footprint But as sure as heck, I know there's a lot of literature and insights from anthropology that I can operationalize that's currently not being done across the board, where this topic is concerned, that I will try to test in these experimental settings. And this is, I think, part of the reason that I said, like we both the playful as a mindset, but also what anthropology and a fieldwork mentality to AI is also quite, it's very valuable. So
Yeah.
now the hard questions. Now Matt and I get to be potentially fusilated with, a lot of questions we cannot answer.
Well, and I want to just add to that that Matt and Laura's comments about the sort of playful and yet critical approach. I mean, uh, there's the Algorithmic Justice Collective or whatever it's called. There are lots of it seems to be particularly in the US, lots of scholarship about how AI and these sorts of processes have created ethical problems, environmental problems, reified hierarchies based upon race and others, linguistic hierarchies. And I think those are relevant. I think all of us agree that these are relevant considerations. Um, and uh, and I was trained in so-called applied anthropology, and I'm at a so-called applied anthropology program. Um, but it seems to me that then it becomes a so what? What do we do with the findings? If we find that this is a problem, then what? Are we just going to sit there and say this is bad? Um, I think that is, there's a value in critique, but I think there's also value in considering going and doing more, and not to be an apologist for the industry, um, but to, be building things as much as we can. I'm looking forward to my spring semester, which starts on Monday, to trying to figure out how I can use AI in some of my assignments. And germane to what some of the questions were, this is not, I don't see in any way as a substitute, much like some of the work of on digital anthropology. This is not somehow a throwing out of participant observation or anything like this. This is another tool if we understand how to use it. And so it should enrich training and enrich our as a tool set within anthropology if we're doing even so-called traditional anthropology. But even the learning how to use it can be, I liked what Laura was saying is like the field work approach to learning AI. I think that was really nice. And one little fine point, and I don't know if either Matt or Laura can talk a little bit about this, the issue of the difference in ecological approaches to data centers. I think someone had told me once that China seems to be having a very good way of developing their data centers in a much more environmentally friendly manner. But I don't know if one of you can say something before we hit the questions.
I think it's a question of it's not just a question of the building environment. I mean, one of the experiments that I mentioned is exactly dealing with, architects I'm currently reading literally the standards for how do you build data centers, right? And so I'm talking to architects on what alternatives there are to these standards and how do we start conceiving of the built environment and the standardization around data centers. But I think the one point that I would like to make is that that's one part of the story. Data centers are just like one aspect of this long chain. Again, I'm going to mention the concept of infrastructure that enables AI, but it should not be devoid from, and completely decoupled from human practice. And so we can start talking about language here as an infrastructure. How do we prompt cultures of prompting? Then it gets very interesting because Do we, the way that we prompt in German or Bulgarian or English or Swahili is very different because there's different grammars, right? And different cultural ideas that are encoded in the way that we ask questions. Is that potentially, how do we quantify that and how do we build cultures of prompting that coupled together with the fact that there's a very physical element to the environmental footprint of AI in terms of, the cooling and carbon emissions and water usage, right? So they all come together in this really complex whole that gives rise to this thing that's AI. And I think again, the insights that are coming from anthropology in the past, if you look at the more than human done, if you look at the all the literature and conversations we've had on the Anthropocene, they are, at least the way that I read them and the way that I see them, they're immediately translatable into very practical suggestions that can be made. Now, the question is, of course, how do we get a place at that table where those decisions are made? How do we convince people that they need to listen to us? And that's perhaps, not at all a topic about that concerns only AI, that concerns all of anthropology, also in different, same goes for medical anthropology, same goes for, how do we become a lot more influential in making decision makers account for and build with anthropological insights. And I think this is also why I really am very bullish and excited about the idea of anthropologists becoming founders. Because as hard as the founder journey is, and it's really, really hard to be a founder, I think you do get to have to be a decision maker from day one, right? And as a form of knowledge making and as a form of intervention in the world, I think that's an exciting avenue for translating and scaling anthropological insights and anthropological ethics and the way that we are committed to the world in ways that perhaps I don't know. I mean, it's hard to be a founder. I find it's also very hard to convince really big industrial players. So I don't know which is harder, but I do know that perhaps being a founder affords you a little bit more of a say on how these products can come into the world. So that's, I think, founder anthropology is very exciting in that sense as a way of intervening.
And just quickly riffing on that and then coming back to the infrastructure question, and I'll try to tie it into some of the open questions. Even if you don't want to start a company, which, you also can do just as a side thing, right? It doesn't always have to be like the main thing. That's what I'm doing these days. But if you wanted to have more influence, and let's say you've worked in tech and you have a little understanding of that space, I would encourage folks to look at product management roles. Product manager is ultimately responsible for everything from, what do we build and why, importantly, right, through go to market. And you, in the end, are going to make the call on what ships, like what features ship in a product. And so you have tremendous influence over the digital products that go into the world. Um, and you will, even though you may yourself not be doing the research, or at least, such deep dives, um, you will likely at the very least be directing it, right? And it's very research adjacent, even to the point where, like, I write off the research plans as a first draft, and then work with the research team, to try and sort of align, roadmap with the research. So, if you already work in tech and you have some tech experience and can speak that language, and maybe you work in UX today, but you want more influence, but you also don't want to be a founder, product management is a really nice space to be. Coming back to infrastructure and just building what Laura said, and I'll try to knock out a couple questions to the best of my ability. I think we also need to realize all the invisible infrastructure from the people that are paid low, very small amounts of money all around the world in unfair circumstances, all the way up through, data centers and the GPUs that sit in them, right? And I think we need to be aware of, all of the actants that are involved in that network and how they all come together to produce the outcome that we have today. And it's a very large, complex process with a lot of issues along the way. And I am not downplaying any of them, and I would encourage everybody to get involved and try to make that better. However, if any of you have ever bought clothing, right, from a fast fashion company, which at this point, anything in any basic mall is basically fast fashion, even if they weren't a fast fashion brand 20 years ago, you've probably engaged in a similar supply chain, right? Or if you were, and I say you, but I mean me as well, right? Right. If we've not so thoughtfully bought certain chocolate, we've likely engaged in similar supply chains. And that doesn't mean that AI gets, it gets a pass because other things are equally kind of messed up. It just means to say that AI and the whole invisible supply chain, visible and invisible supply chain, is not unlike other supply chains. And we all need to think critically about that. And we can make a difference in that, right, to at least to degrees, and we should try to make a difference in that. But we also, I think, need to, it's easy to throw that question out right now without sometimes also like thinking about our own behaviors. So if we buy fast fashion, if we fly to conferences, if we eat cows, which I forget the number, but it's like, right, 100 joules of energy to one for a plant, or maybe 1,000, I forget. It's been a long time since I looked at that lit. Right, but like there are lots of things we do on a daily basis that are very polluting, have bad supply chains. And so I think we need to just also think about like, it's easy to throw rocks at AI, but we should probably also do the same at other things that probably some of us engage in, including myself, and work on all of those. Again, doesn't dismiss the problems of AI. However, on the AI front, again, coming back, Kiran, so I can't necessarily speak to like data center design because it's not a space I've ever looked at. But particularly coming out of China, what they've done is a technique of distillation where they're taking our large language models and in some cases sort of distilling them down and using a few other kind of creative techniques to train models in the pre-training phase at a lot cheaper cost than we are training ours. Um, but you also see on the inference side, so there is pre-training, which gets the model to the point where it can be shipped in a product. And then there is basically everything that, I mean, there's also post-training that goes involved that costs energy with reinforcement learning and other methods. But once it's in a product and you're using it, there is the sort of test time computer inference costs. Those have already dropped basically 100% over 2 years and are continuing to plummet. So that again doesn't wash AI of any environmental problems. It just means to say that like those are the kind of engineering improvements that can be made, especially when transdisciplinary teams are thinking about these problems critically and working together, right? And that's another reason why we should get involved, right? To keep making those improvements so that we get it as best as possible. And in tech, with every release, we try to do a little bit better. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes we regress, but the goal is do some research, learn, release something that's a little bit better.
Well, we're coming towards the end of our time, you know. So I wanted to put forth a question because I looked through the questions and it seems like we've touched on quite a few of them. There's specific questions that individuals have. So two things. First, if I can't recall, is if someone wanted to reach out to one of us, is our information available? Are we put like our contact information, our emails? Is that something we are willing to?
I'm okay sharing, I'll share my
Yeah.
LinkedIn address where you could always find me at. We didn't put out anything with SfAA images, but also I'll link to SfAA's LinkedIn page and other socials so that people can follow like there for the next events.
Okay.
Yeah, I absolutely reach out on LinkedIn. And I typed already my email, but I'll type it again. Somebody was asking earlier, so um,
Okay.
I'm always happy um, to correspond with people and to take up ideas and questions further.
And I put my USF webpage there with has my email and other information there. Um, so if it's early career anthropologists or really anyone who is willing to consider making a pivot in their anthropological work were to take one lesson from this webinar and this conversation, what would you want them to carry forward when they think about AI and the future of anthropology?
Yeah. Laura, you want to go or?
It's an opportunity. It really is. There are the risks, and I know that we are as anthropologists very critical, and we rightly should be, but also we should look at it for the opportunity that it is. Not only to expand the existing repertoire of the discipline and to, I think, intervene in the world in a way that makes our commitment to it a lot more responsible. I think of intervention as the responsible way of saying thank you to the world that we study, right? Because, if we just, if we go out and we abstract the knowledge and, we go to our departments and we write our articles, and because the way things are, they end up behind paywalls, right? That formula, if you really critically think about it at their own practice, that's also quite irresponsible, at least to me. And so for me, being, an applied anthropologist and intervening and being a founder is a way of being a more responsible anthropologist. And so I think, it's AI is an opportunity also for, I know there's a legitimate rationale behind why we can also see it as a threat to anthropology, but I think it's also an opportunity for anthropology to reinvent itself and in many ways to survive. Not necessarily in the formats that we know it, but change is good. And I think I think it's an exciting time. It's a bit scary, and AI itself, if it can also be a bit scary if you're not slightly taken aback, you're probably not paying attention. But that's not a reason to retreat into extreme critique or critique for critique's sake or for pessimism. It's a rather an invitation for doing a lot more.
Yeah, and I would say, I wouldn't miss out on that opportunity because, again, going back to something I said very early on, we don't want another social media moment where we kind of, engage in critical distance without sort of really getting in as early as possible to direct that and then seeing sort of the negative outcomes that have come from it. And those are real potentials here, right? So getting involved early, I think is good for all of us, can be good for the discipline. These are also good jobs, right? Like family sustaining roles. That means, you can travel to conferences, contribute back as a practicing individuals, even donate, right? All those things become, these, again, these become more of a, easier realities with these kind of roles. That it opens up such opportunities to even help the field in many ways when the field is struggling at the moment. But most importantly, again, sort of riffing off similar language from Laura, it's just, this is something that is happening whether we like it or not. And working day in and day out, building these products beyond anything I talked about here today, I would argue that it is moving much quicker, even though a lot of things aren't going to come true, and even though a lot of companies are going to go out of business, particularly probably smaller ones, um, it is still moving much quicker than I think we sometimes like to accept. And, things we could not do even 3 months ago, we can now do, right? We can have, code writing for hours at this point, time. And there's just a whole host of opportunities here that we have the ability to leverage to benefit ourselves. And on a personal note, it can just open up all kinds of, it really can unlock creativity. Like there are so many things I always wished I could do that I wasn't able to do in the past that I'm now doing, like writing my own software code or at least partnering to write it. There are things about like music production that I always struggled with that are now easier for me to do. I'm not using AI to write my songs, but like there are techniques like compression and other things that I use it for. There are things about editing audio and video that I used to use it for with the podcast, right from the very beginning, like removing noise. And so imagine you have interviews that you've recorded, right? Great for removing the background noise. There's just so many opportunities across the entire research life cycle as an anthropologist, and even more so, there are many opportunities across what we do in our personal lives to unlock creativity and do things in new ways that I have found really inspiring, right? And so beyond just anthropology, this is also an opportunity to just grow and learn and express your maybe latent creativity that you couldn't always express because maybe you didn't have the skills to execute on that. And we're basically back in a period of using language to control machines. We started with that in many ways, or at least we were in a period of that prior to user interfaces that we point and click. We're now back to that, and we're using natural language to carry out very complex tasks that can help you do really, again, sort of rewarding and inspiring work. And so, across the board, I would just encourage everybody to get involved. Again, study it critically, try to use it, from a methodological perspective and start intervening in any way, shape, or form. If you're concerned about governance, look at UN roles or whatever it may be, state roles, federal roles, whatever it is, and get involved right from a governance perspective. Opportunities abound. If you want to build tech products, you can go do that. Right? So.
Okay, and thank you both. I'd also like to just throw in my 2 cents, and as well as bring this to a close, is that this is, if we take our anthropological understanding and approach to this, then I think that might reduce some of the emotional toll and the anxiety. So if we just think of this as like this is a tool. Um, does the tool have social and environmental and ecological, ethical consequences? Yes, it does, like any tool. And so we need to keep that perspective on this. Um, and this is not necessarily using AI is not, I think, Matt, you had said something like, let's see if I can find this. This is not using a database of facts, but this is a particular construction with LLMs and whatnot. So this is not somehow replacing, and I don't see it as somehow replacing anthropology or field work, nor do I see it as a problem of reducing things and as saying like this is reducing human experience to some sort of processed thing. Well, in social science, get rid of the notion of AI for a second. Any sort of findings is a reduction of reality. If we're taking an interview and talking about what it means, it's a reduction and a synthesis. So this is just a computerized version of doing that. So we shouldn't be scared to necessarily think about this as being a reduction of reality or elimination of the validity of human experience. I think this is a great opportunity for creativity as a recovering musician myself. Um, then I love the sort of ways that we've imbued this conversation with creativity and potentiality. And I thank both Matt and Laura for being here. I thank our audience for being here, for all your questions and comments. This is the first of several, and we will be at the SfAAs, and we have our contact information there. So I want to end on a high note. Thank you all very much. This has been really exciting. So anything for you two before we close?
Yeah, I'll just double tap that. Thank you all for joining. A lot more coming, so do stay tuned to the social media channels for Society for Applied Anthropology. Kiran, thanks for leading. Nice job. And Laura, thank you for joining. Also, great job. And look forward to the conversation with everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Well.